Hello, people. Chapter 9. Chapter 9. My dad's life story. The story continues this week. Chapter 9. You're familiar with the story, right? As where we are today. Today is the 6th of May, 2025. Pretty good. Nagaga tule bulungi nnyo. Get your popcorn. Get what you're drinking on. It's gonna be a long one as well. Same like last week. Last week we had about 56 minutes of explosive revelations about the birth of Kegus. Nze nali siri wakuzaalibwa ku ssaawa eyo. I wasn't about the time to be born, but I was conceived during a romantic whirlwind romance my dad and my mom were having. They were on a romantic getaway in Kenya, Nairobi. The Fairmount Norfolk Hotel. Very, very much an exclusive place. You had to be someone to check in, you know what I mean? There had a time my dad was working with the cooperative union, so it was part and parcel of, privileges. You could afford such privileges, Yeah. Anyway, so the 1970s are the dawn of new things. First of all, in January 1971, the president of Uganda at the time, Dr. Apollo Milton Obote, is overthrown or ousted. Yeah, because it was a coup d'etat, but not really in the way things happen or the way things used to happen during those days. The army, ceremoniously, they didn't even attack, they just took over the radio station. And then there was a moment of silence for about a day. Later on, there's a broadcast, blah, 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 blah. But of course, with all the excitement that proceeded after that, it was obvious that the president had been overthrown. There was a lot of anger in the country. And the army had its own reasons as to why they wanted things different. Kyembagamba kino ekyamini kigenda kujja mu bintu bingi nnyo ebigenda okuplayinga mu ba young elites. Remember, post-independence, 1962, when we get our independence as a country, as a young nation, Uganda yatwayikyali baana bato. We were still just walking out of the crib, you know what I mean? So we had the constitutional crisis in 1966. The king abdicates, then finds his way to the UK and seeks asylum. Kawaka Frederick Mutesa would later pass away. So come 1971, you see, we need to look back as we move forward. It is that very year that the new government of Idi Amin would return the remains of the king. But that is very ironic because from the literature of the day, President Idi Amin now, who's the president in 71, had led the attack on the king's palace. And from what I've read and from what people used to say, nti balumba olubiri ne balukuba ebikonkola. It was savage. I've seen some videos of what were the remains of the attack. So it was a brutal attack, and it is argued that it is President Obote, who had engineered that attack because he was clashing with the president, the king. Okay, so what was happening post-independence? It was, I think, a clash of powers, and that is where the bracket comes in, that the elite, the young elites, who had been molded and shaped around, I would say, the doctrine of Uganda as a country, minus the politics and the shenanigans. Do you get me? Because I don't think the Kabaka Yeka Party and UPC alliance was a convenience thing at the time, but I think it rubbed off differently. So when you find yourself at that junction, kubanga tikamba buli ekintu kiri kimu abantu bangi nnyo abaali basomedde mu by'emmengo. Mengo had planted a generation that was now being positioned in different areas. Abegombolola, ab'amasaza mu disitulikiti yonna ng'osangayo, the Buganda influence was dominating Uganda. So the contradiction would be nti kakati tata wange, let's go back to my dad. So my dad's first job in the mango growers was more like a public service responsibility, but it came with a lot of, it was 4 jobs in one: principal, chief, financial auditor. And he was able to do much and achieve much that by 1971, when things change, being that he had been an insider, you were privy to a lot of innings and outings, comings and goings. Mufuna bulungi nnyo. So you would be in that position to predict, and that is going to influence a lot in his decisions as to why he unceremoniously resigns from the job. Amini bwe yajja yasooka kulonchera kye bayita economic war. Era economic war egenda kuyingira mu bamafuta mingi. These young elites who had gone into business, entrepreneurship, industrialism, they took up very many good sectors. Because with the exit of the Asians, we shall come to that part, because the economic war didn't affect only the Asians. There was a power shift. Much together, a power shift would mean patronage, the access to the resources and influence. My dad was in a very, very big budget, a very, very huge budget that encompassed signing off big projects, auditing big projects, financial decisions and all that. Mufuna bulungi nnyo. That is 1971. And from the facts that we can say were prevailing, when they returned the remains of the Kabaka in 1971, it kind of humbled my dad. It humbled him so much that I think he realized that everything has a shortcoming, and hastily put in mind that he's got to settle down, maybe start a family, and slow down. Kakati yeyo Mengo Boys Club, and I think he had maintained his influence over, having been the head boy or head prefect of his year, class 1965. Kati era bebali mu mbaga, they were the movers and the shakers now in all sectors and all this. So my dad finds himself touched And by the end of 1971, that's when I'm conceived in October during the whirlwind romance. Kubanga ebintu bingi nnyo muzeeyi wange teyandibikoze ku ssaawa ne mu myaka gye yali ayina. Yali 23, 24, 25 years. Yeah, and I've always asked myself, even now, you give me a 23-year-old who makes decisions on that magnitude, you know, to settle down, get married, build houses, do this, do that, do that. So 1971 ends on a high note. It's a double whammy. A double whammy. And what comes next? In 1972, my dad tenders in his resignation. He's only worked the job approximately 3 years, max 4. Because 1969, when he graduates at Bukalasa Agricultural College, ng'olwo abayingiza ebintu byani bya Common Man's Charter. Did I explain Common Charter very well, people? If I can take you back a little bit. There was this dossier, let's call it a dossier, of ideology Obote was fronting on the basis of either communism or socialism, courtesy of Nyerere influence and, of course, the Eastern Bloc. Kakati kino ekintu kino kyalimu ebintu bingi nnyo. When we gained our independence, there was the world order of the West and the East, or the Western Bloc, which was the capitalism, and then the Eastern Bloc, which was the communism. So those are spheres of influence. And I don't know how it came about, but it had this grandiose theory that people have to see things in one way. Aba communists, the grandiose projects, the big things, blah, 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 blah. And that later on would play out in a template. Era bazimbanga amalwaliro ag'omu kitundu bakola bintu bye bityo. Individualism is out, communalism. Kati, of course, that would work depending on the power. So that's when we had the constitutional crisis, the abrogation of the constitution, and then they had the pigeonhole, and then whatever, it was hastily put through, and then technically Uganda becomes, all was to become, a communist country. That was the Common Man's Charter. In 1966, kwe kuva entabwe y'omulubiri okujjako kabaka. Then Obote, as the Prime Minister, becomes the President of the First Republic of Uganda. 1966. My dad is still studying. He has just finished Mengo Senior School, and he's in Bukalasa for his 3 years. So he was caught in between the doldrums. Ekintu kyesuuba na kyesuuba. Ekyasimbira kubanga kati bino ebyali in place byali bitambulira ku framework ndala. The powers were more in the parliament. Bulange yakolanga ebyayo ne parliament of Uganda nekola ebyayo. So the powers within the MPs, nebya president, so the powers were vetoed to be presidential powers. So a lot of people were probably confused with what was going on, and that would later on bring about the clash. Mango growers, my dad's first job, that Mango Growers Cooperative Union divided itself into two. then it became West, then it became East, West Mengo, East Mengo, West Mengo, East Mengo. It was the beginning of the downfall of probably what was thought to be a grand project of things. Naye bino ebya cooperative tuddayo gye bitandikira mu 1957 bamusaazi ba Ben Kiwanuka ebyo sibigendamu because tebiri part of the story, but the whole template of Ugandan politics is based on that struggle. There was no power for independence. Uganda tetwalwana ng'eby'e Kenya. The Kenyans had the Mau Mau, whatever. Many African countries had fought for their independence. Uganda ffe baatuwa buwi independence. Kati bya independence, when you go deep into the independence studies, the colonial concept was running out. The British Empire was at its demise. It couldn't maintain, the so-called Great Britain Empire. So they were relinquishing the countries more or less. Time was up. Mufuna bulungi nnyo. So by Independence Day, there had been a power play. Uganda had entered political party politics. Mufuna bulungi nnyo. Uganda National Congress, Uganda People's Congress. Mulaba ekintu ekigatta. Ebya UPC, then Kabaka Yeka Party, then DP Party, Democratic Party, Ayabalimi. So everything is rooted in cooperatives. So at the tip of that, my dad now was in the middle of everything. So yali amanyi bingi. Naye ate nga baali bakifunyemu baanya okusinga. Kakati bano abakoloni, they had played it very well. Nti baali creating the elite. That's how my father was able to access education at the time through the Church Missionary Society. The missionary society was there providing that privilege of education. Remember in the very beginning when the missionaries brought education, reading, writing and whatever religion, it's only the chief's children, abalangira, n'abantu abakungu, tujuye abataka, bebabifunamu ennyo. Kati omwana w'omuntu, you had to either be sponsored, era nze nkyogera, era even my dad used to say it, nti yasomera ku Scala. Nga Kabaka was impressed by his prowess in football. That's how he was able to make it through and achieve so much at that time. Okay. So come 1972, with the things the way they were going, that is the very year in June I'm born, 72. That is the very year he gets married to my mom. You get me? And that is the very year now Uganda is at crossroads. If you know what I mean, do you know what the raid at Entebbe was about? So, internationally, the president at the time puts Uganda at the pedestal, clashing with, international politics is very complex. The forces were coming from outside now. Nabagamba last week nti emyaka omunana Amin gye yafuga yali akimanyi nti bamuggyako anytime. It was a precarious moment for him. So in and out, to the point that later on, when we continue the conversation, we shall reach the OAU summit that was held in 1975 when Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Palestinian, but he came to Uganda. There were many other things. Even Gaddafi came to Uganda during that conference. So Uganda at that time, in the 70s, becomes a playground of international politics. So today in 1972, when my dad now resigns, kubanga ebyemmengo growers byali bitandise okubeera complicated. How? Because of the changes now that were coming in. Remember, these cooperatives were independent of the politics of the day. Kati bigenda kuyingira mu gavumenti. Later on, I'm going to introduce Coffee Marketing Board. Coffee Marketing Board had been there. It had been founded in 1964. However, in the 70s, things changed. Mwemuli Uncle Roger Mukasa, mukwano gwa muzeeyi wange, kakati bonna beeriti bava mu bintu ebyo ebyaliwo at the time ne batandika okwepositioninga. Remember, balina ssente. So it wasn't about what they were losing, but what was coming next. Kakati bw'otunuulira last week nabagamba ekya President Yoweri Museveni, olwo ye ali Mozambique, kubanga Amin olwajja, there was the immediate response to fight against him, to overthrow him. And he knew where yali amanyi. He knew, because most of the people who were fighting against him had been insiders. Kiraba? Because me would speculate initially the struggle would have been to return Obote, but things changed later. Because if you call something a revolution, if you call something like a Salvation Front, or if you call something like something, and this is going to culminate in 1979, Kikosi, Mali, whatever, in Moshi, there was when they overthrow Idi Amin. And the forces came from outside, from Tanzania. You shall get there. So, in 1972, the decision to settle down is imminent. My dad, he had so many contacts because it was up and down. And at the time, we have the East African community, which would defunct later on. Twalina ebintu bingi nnyo bye twalimu East Africa, East African railways and harbors, East African hotels, East African this, East African that. Everything was about East Africa. So in the interim time, things like that meant my dad would have to travel a lot. And okutambula ogende Kenya mu 71 era yali kuzi conferences zaabwe ezo zibagendamu ebyo ebya community. So he had gone with my mom nga muto yatwala mami wange. And what happened thereafter was the wedding, which we've already talked about, the wedding of the year in 1972. It was highly anticipated and well attended. The who is who attended. So after the wedding in 1972, I'm born 2 months later. The wedding was in April. I was born in June. So the rest of the year, pretty much, my dad has entered what? Fatherhood, marriage life, responsibilities. But he was doing a lot at the same time. He was doing this, he was doing that, he was doing that. So by the end of the year, he has left the job. He had left the job because of the internal shenanigans. Whatever was going on didn't sit right with him. So, beginning of 1973, he goes into business. Kati olwo business gyebagenda okutandika yali joint partnership ne Gordon wava muno nga bagiyita spear touring and travel. Later on that would become Spear Motors, Demula. Kati mzee wange, I would love to speak with Sir Gordon Wavamuno one day, probably when he can talk about it, how things went about, because there was the interplay of things. Kati mzee wange yali amanyi bingi nnyo mu government. Amanyi ba minister bangi kati ngenda kuletawo, I think that we shall talk about it next week. Henry Chemba nga bali bonna balina ebintu naye baafunanga access to government. Nene ebyali bitandise okutuuka mu Uganda nga bingi. Uganda was ticking on so many things internally. Hali n'ebijjirira ebijja bitambula. There was a lot of internal unrest, internal killings. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of. He diverted a lot of his interest as well into football after the revival of the Uganda Federation Cup, which later on would become FUFA, Federation Uganda Football Association. In the early beginning of the league, they were the dominant teams. Of course, my dad had sided with KCC due to his friendship with the mayor, Walusimbi Mpanga. Walusimbi Mpanga playing a role nyingi nnyo mu mukwano gwabwe nti baatimba Kampala Road. He was very, very close to my dad. Nga beemanyi kati ate n'afuna ne access ku bintu ebirala byonna omanyi kati bibeeramu kituyita networking. You could get juicy contracts, you could get lucrative, tenders and things like that. But of course the friendship was there in terms of football. I think at baali bamumanyi. Kati 72, my dad is 25. He could still have gone back into football, but he couldn't make that decision again because kati omanyi oba omaze okugaggawala, but more or less you're settled. Your decisions are made based on what's happening around you. So now omupiira n'agubeeramu nga patron supporter, olwo agenda kuplaying a role y'amaanyi nnyo. Kati ekizimbe kye kyaliko KCC Club House. Later on it became an arcade. Mumanyi opposite Pioneer Mall edda we yali afaanana. Kakati if you want the proper location of that building, Centenary Building, is it Mapera House? Okay, Bombo Road, City Square, whatever corner, sandwiched in between that tiny building, it used to be the KCC Clubhouse for supporters. kiraba. So it was a hangout joint, you know, they had a bar, it had entertainment in there. And on match days, that's where even the players would come before they go for that coming up with that idea back in the day. My dad was one of the initiators of that. He had so many things he had done in Kampala there. Kati nga ne bwe nabagamba ekizimbe kyaki kya HQ Mengo wekiri mu Kampala wekizimbe nakibabuulira wekiri nkiddemu Mengo Growers Cooperative Union HQ headquarters opposite railway station. Yes, that used to be the HQ. So he knew the maneuvering of how things kati nadda mu mupiira administratively, but on the arm's length kuteeka mu ssente bazanye bitya kati olwo bagenda kukwatagana again ne Uncle Patrick. Kati ye Uncle Patrick Kiwanuka ye naye ali mu businesses, ali mu insurance, ayingidde ebintu bingi nnyo era ebyo bya influencing my dad also to go the business avenue. Olwo kati agenda kusettinga up zinaalaba general merchandise eyingire emmwanyi eyo emmwanyi njogerako nnyo wano because nze nalaba ku business ey'emmwanyi nga bwe yali etambula nga ndi mwana muto. Nalaba ku ssente nga bazireeta mu bisawo awaka, nalaba ku zituleera, twalina ebyuma, twalina faamu. Kati eyo faamu ey'ekakiri agigula mu 70s my dad ng'ayingira farming. Very nice farm. Kuliko ente nga balimira nako, kuliko ne tractors zirima bintu byenjogerako. Kati he had so many ideas he had learnt in Bukalasa Agricultural College, so he couldn't fail. Are we good? So are we seeing the transformation of my dad before his 30s? He, you know, kakati many times making decisions about taking a risk, and the risk can be played out in either success or failure, but also the circumstances that were prevailing. Batanze okuarrestinga mikwano gyabwe, batta abantu, omanyi ne Bishop Lumunga bamutta. A lot of prominent people. Kati Amini n'atandika okwekengera bano abayanga elite nga nti bamutawaanya. Bayanga elite, they became privy to his suspicion. Kiraba kati awo ne tuba nga tuddukaddukamukko ne tubeerako Kenya. Olwo ndi mwana muto, I was a kid, man. Bazaala sister wange omulala, bazaala sister wange omulala, and that is all in the 70s. Naye tukyali wano in the beginning. Ayingira business, my dad, and he's going to launch himself into other ventures. Kati nga in association with friends like nga Murwana. In fact, Murwana ayingira ebya agriculture na byonna on the advice of my dad. Eyo Jessa farm eyo yali similar ku yaffe, naye ate yaffe nja kugamba at the time in the 70s yali more advanced. Yeah, yali more advanced. Yalimu ebintu bingi nnyo ebirungi dadi nga kubanga yali abisomye nga abitegeera bulungi nnyo. Kati ate nga I think he could access many other gold. Mubimanyi, we had valley dams, we had this, ku farm twalina biri. So ku byali bigenda mu maaso, that was the best decision to go. Kati awo bakwataganye ne taata we Muzeeyi Musisi, but round it too, kubanga jjajja n'afuka olwo bamaze omuzimbira ennyumba ye, ennyumba kale taata wange we yakulira. Kubanga my dad didn't grow up in tujja gamba nti yakulira mu nnyumba ya bbeeyi no ebyedda mu 1940s era abantu abasinga basulanga era nga nyumba ya ssubi oba ya ddebe amabaati gajja luvannyuma nnyo like after independence 60s time. Now tuli mu 70s tatange mugagga binojjo ennyumba bagikoonawo ne bazimba ennyumba ey'ettegula nyumba nero kati yali yava dda awaka kyenabagamba nti that was one of the biggest mistakes my dad was haunted by nti kyamulumanga nnyo okuyita wali we bamugambanga nti ewatate on the same road ekitagobwa ku stage ku mutuba emituba egiri awo sigi amabanda nokkirya booti bwowetamu booti yewa ddulufu omugenzi ddulufu lubega nokkirya emmanga nga yewa musisi kati awo waali wa musisi naye tatange n'azimba ennyumba eyo naye tebifaako ngayagala mamu abedda bulungi yes batandika bizinensi endala honest african transporters nga balina omwami omulala bamuyita Alayi ow'ekyebando omusajja ali munubbi yafa n'okufa bambi mukyala Alayi ne mwami Alayi they became very very good family friends era twakula tuzanya n'abaana baabwe Barema Babudu Amida Suji Zainabu bane bonna bakula abazanyira waffe nga twawula bwawuzi ki taka nga bo bali ku lusozi kweri ffe tuli wansi kokko ekyebando noyambuka booti waggulu ewa Alayi honest Africa transport nga balina bifiyaati bafunye bifiyaati byabayitale byebisomba emwanyi ne kago okuva e Mombasa bakola sente kale inayo bizinensi kati tatera natatuka okuteeka sente mu bintu bingi nnyo left right and center naye nga ayingizaamu abafamire ng'abawa emirimu mufuna bulungi nnyo kati when you are beginning out at that time probably you're trying to okusiga ekintu to plant the whole structure of the business and take all the risks left right and center mufuna bulungi nnyo kati noza mulaba what was coming and what was going. Bagoba abayindi when the Asians were expelled they were given 90 days naye kati ffe abazeeyi abaffe tebali ku bintu. I don't think my dad had any access to benefiting in anything, but what it created, it left a gap in the economy that many enterprising Katwiste Africans took advantage of that. But later that would become the Magendo economy yali dismantled. At it became even worse in 1977 when the East African community was defunct. Chayika kati olwo pressure eva left, right and center. Kati ate naamini nga creating the enemies around. So it couldn't work. That is going to explain later on, but natandika chapters ezo. Economy etandika okugwa. The economy, there was a scarcity of goods, there was a lot of smuggling, there was a lot of kati emwanyi bamuzeeyi baffe gye baali bayingidde, there was the emwanyi, so many things were beginning to go wrong, you know what I mean? Kati abazeeyi baffe abamu nga bakiraba nti the right thing to do is to engage in a way ejjako Idi Amin. But that is going to culminate in 1979 when things hit the rock and the hard place. Right when Amin is overthrown, there was again clashes, with internal clashes. Naye nga ba young elite bo baagala ki? A new beginning, a new Uganda based on safeguarding their interests. Bwe bibeera era entalo zonna zirwanibwa bagagga. Omwavu alwana kikyaba alwanirira tewali tewakyuka kati fe amazeeyi abaffe baaluzinga ebintu bingi nnyo. Museveni bw'abagamba nti abadde alwana for the last 60 years. People undermine that statement. Naye nga of course okulwana kubeeramu financiers. Gwajja nakaki ojja mu bufumbo nti oze nagundi nti ate ogamba nti omusajja yankolerera. No. Era ngaoyongeddeku, you have to add something. Era nze kati ku lwange, when I look back now, I wish my dad was around. Yandibadde, I don't think he would be in the government with the Museveni. Kubanga ebyokukola yalina bingi nnyo. But it's unfortunate he took ill very early now. I've told you that story, but we're going to come to that part of the story. Yeah. So as of today, we are entering the 1970s. We've introduced the interim of when my dad gives up his job. There was no reason for him to leave the job. Teyaliwo. But of course, things were beginning to change, and I think he was seizing on new opportunities. And he's in his late 20s. So emagamba nti yali billionaire, nze yembayogera mu biba bituufu. Was a billionaire. And my mom was always proud of my dad. And my mom used to work and study in Kenya. So it was a working relationship, you know what I mean? Mufuna bulungi. Kakati ka video kakomyawo. We are going to continue this video next week, chapter 10. Tyoke kati tuyingire deep into our story. Naye nga story muginyumiddwa nnyo. Story tujja ginyumya, tujja gimalayo. Bwe tunaatuukira mu 80s awo. 80s era. Okidoki. All right.